It's 22 degrees below zero in the Bitterroot Mountains, the kind of unforgiving cold that snaps pine branches like matchsticks and freezes breath before it ever leaves your lungs. Retired Navy SEAL John Callahan thought he had left the ghosts of his past buried in the sand, choosing a life of absolute isolation with his combat-trained German shepherd, Aries. But when a hidden perimeter alarm blares in the dead of a blinding midnight blizzard, the security monitors show something impossible. A man, half dead, crawling through the waist-deep drifts, staring directly into a camouflaged camera. He was begging in the snow, Callahan later said. But when he finally unbolted that heavy oak door, he didn't just let in a desperate survivor. He let in a deadly, classified secret. Stick around, because this story twists in ways you'd never expect. The wind howled through the Montana Valley like a wounded animal. For 3 days, a relentless blizzard had battered the high country, dropping 4 feet of snow and cutting off the few scattered logging roads that led back to civilization. For John Callahan, this wasn't a crisis. It was the entire point. After 20 years of operating in the world's most hostile environments, from the dust-choked streets of Fallujah to the jagged ridges of the Hindu Kush, Callahan had sought a place where the world could not reach him. His cabin, a fortified structure of thick timber and steel, sat entirely off the grid. The only heartbeat for miles, other than his own, belonged to Aries. Aries was a 75-pound German shepherd, but calling him a pet would be a severe mischaracterization. Aries was a highly decorated, Navy SEAL-trained multi-purpose canine, MPC. He had been trained to detect improvised explosive devices, apprehend fleeing combatants in pitch-black compounds, and parachute out of C-130S strapped to Callahan's chest. When an IED in Syria ended Aries' operational career with a piece of shrapnel to his left hind leg, Callahan had pulled every string in the Pentagon to adopt him. They were 2 broken soldiers who understood the language of silence perfectly. At 11:42 p.m., the cabin was lit only by the low, flickering orange glow of the wood stove and the green LED displays of Callahan's solar battery bank. Callahan sat at his heavy oak table, methodically field-stripping and oiling his Sig Sauer P226 pistol. It was a muscle memory exercise, a way to keep his hands busy and his mind empty. Beside the stove, Aries lay curled on a heavy rug. Suddenly, the dog's ears snapped up. The massive shepherd didn't bark. He didn't even growl. Instead, he let out a low, vibrating chuff deep in his chest and sat bolt upright, his intelligent amber eyes locking onto the reinforced front door. A second later, the cabin's silent alarm system triggered. Callahan didn't flinch. His hands moved with terrifying, practiced speed. In 3 seconds, the pistol was reassembled, the slide racked, and a round chambered. He stood up, his bare feet silent on the hardwood floor, and moved toward the bank of security monitors built into the wall beside the kitchen. The cabin was surrounded by a sophisticated array of FLIR, forward-looking infrared cameras, disguised as birdhouses and tree knots. In the dead of a Montana winter, the screens usually showed the glowing white silhouettes of deer, or occasionally, a mountain lion. Tonight, camera feed number 4, covering the treacherous, steep southern approach to the property, showed a thermal anomaly. Callahan tapped the screen, enhancing the contrast. Through the heavy, swirling bands of white snow captured by the lens, a human figure emerged. Callahan's jaw tightened. The nearest paved road was 22 miles away. The snow was chest-high in the drifts. It was -22 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills plummeting past -40. A human being out there wasn't just lost. They were dead on their feet. But as he watched the tactical feed, his instincts, honed over decades of warfare, began to scream. The figure wasn't stumbling aimlessly like a lost hiker. The man was moving methodically, using the tree line for cover against the wind. More concerning was his path. He had somehow bypassed the outer 2 tripwire sensors entirely, navigating the only blind spot in Callahan's mile-wide perimeter. Someone trained, Callahan whispered to himself. He keyed the camera to zoom in. The figure was wearing a heavy, snow-caked parka, but their movements were growing sluggish, uncoordinated. The cold was finally winning. As the figure broke from the tree line and staggered into the small clearing before the cabin's porch, they collapsed, sinking deep into a snowdrift. Aries whined. It wasn't an alert whine. It was an anxious, confused sound. The dog trotted to the monitor, placing his front paws on the console, staring at the screen. Callahan looked from the dog to the screen. The figure in the snow began to crawl, dragging his body weight inch by agonizing inch toward the porch. He reached the bottom step, his face lifting toward the hidden camera lens mounted beneath the cabin's eaves. The thermal imaging couldn't show facial details, but it showed the man raising a trembling, frostbitten hand. He was begging. In any other situation, an ordinary man would have rushed to the door, thrown it open, and played the hero. John Callahan was not an ordinary man, and the world he came from did not reward blind heroism. It usually punished it with a bullet. Ambush tactic. Callahan's mind coldly calculated. Use a wounded or helpless point man to draw the target out, then hit the doorway with overlapping fields of fire from the tree line. Callahan left the monitors. He moved to the gun safe in the hallway, his thumb pressing against the biometric scanner. The heavy steel door clicked open. He bypassed the hunting rifles and reached for his M4 carbine, the same customized platform he had carried in his final deployments. He clicked a 30-round magazine of 5.56mm hollow points into the magwell, chambered a round, and clicked the safety on. He moved back to the living room. "Aries, hold," he commanded in a low, firm voice. The German Shepherd immediately stopped pacing, sitting perfectly still about 10 feet from the front door, his eyes locked on the heavy wood. But again, Aries was acting strangely. When a hostile presence was near, Aries would lower his center of gravity, the fur on his spine standing up, waiting for the command to neutralize. Tonight, the dog's tail gave a slight, uncertain wag. He was whining a sound of recognition or distress. Callahan checked the other camera feeds. Camera 1, 2, and 3 showed nothing but the violent, swirling snow. No thermal signatures in the tree line. No sniper hides. No squad moving in formation. Just one dying man on the porch. On the screen, the man had stopped moving. The bright white thermal signature of his body was beginning to dim, a terrifying visual representation of his core temperature plummeting. If Callahan waited another 5 minutes, the man would freeze to death on his welcome mat. He was begging in the snow, Callahan muttered, the image burning into his mind. The man hadn't just looked at the cabin. He had looked at the camera. He knew it was there. Callahan made his choice. He slung the rifle by its tactical strap, keeping it easily maneuverable, and stepped up to the door. He unlatched the heavy deadbolts, the metal cold against his skin. He swung the door inward. The roar of the blizzard was immediate and deafening. A wall of sub-zero wind blasted into the cabin, instantly dropping the temperature in the room and scattering ash from the wood stove. The snow lashed at Callahan's face like tiny shards of glass. He kept the rifle raised, scanning the dark tree line over the iron sights, searching for muzzle flashes. Nothing. He looked down. The man was curled into a fetal position on the icy planks of the porch, half buried under a fresh drift. He wasn't moving. Callahan stepped out into the howling storm, grabbing the man by the collar of his frozen parka. The material was stiff as armor. With a grunt of exertion, Callahan dragged the heavy, ice-covered weight across the threshold and into the cabin, kicking the heavy oak door shut with his heel. The sudden silence in the room was absolute, save for the crackle of the fire and the ragged, wet, shallow breathing of the man on the floor. "Aries, perimeter," Callahan ordered. The dog immediately broke from his sit, jogging to the windows, sniffing the seals, and listening intently, acting as an early warning system. Callahan knelt beside the frozen figure. The man's face was obscured by a thick, ice-encrusted balaclava and a pair of shattered ski goggles. His body was shivering violently, a good sign, meaning his nervous system hadn't entirely shut down yet. "Hey," Callahan barked, his voice carrying the sharp edge of command. "Can you hear me? Don't move. You're inside." The man didn't respond. His hands, encased in thick tactical gloves, were clutched tightly over his stomach, as if holding his organs in. Callahan knew the clock was ticking. Stage 3 hypothermia was imminent. He needed to get the wet, freezing layers off the man immediately to assess for frostbite and raise his core temperature. He pulled a folding tactical knife from his pocket and began slicing through the thick nylon of the man's outer coat. As the parka fell away, Callahan froze. Beneath the civilian winter gear, the man was wearing a black Kevlar plate carrier. This wasn't hunting gear. This was a low-profile military rig, the kind used by private military contractors or intelligence operatives working black sites. Callahan's grip on his knife tightened. He shifted his weight, preparing for a close-quarters struggle, but the man was entirely limp. Callahan cut through the plate carrier straps and pulled it aside. Attached to the molly webbing on the chest of the rig was something entirely out of place in the Montana wilderness, a ruggedized military-spec titanium hard drive, heavily secured with industrial zip ties. It had a biometric lock pad on the casing. Whoever this man was, he was carrying data that someone was likely willing to kill for. And he had brought it straight to Callahan's doorstep. The air in the cabin smelled of melting snow and ozone. Callahan ignored the hard drive for the moment. The primary objective was keeping the subject alive to interrogate him. A dead courier couldn't answer the dozens of questions currently racing through the retired SEAL's mind. He dragged the man closer to the wood stove, laying him out on the heavy wool rug. Aries walked over, sniffing the man's boots, his tail wagging slightly faster now. The dog let out a sharp, recognizing woof and nudged the man's frozen hand with his wet nose. "Back up, Aries," Callahan commanded, pushing his own confusion aside. Why did the dog act like he knew this stranger? Callahan grabbed a pair of trauma shears from a medical kit on the wall and began cutting away the man's frozen undershirts. The man's skin was pale, tinged with a dangerous, waxy blue at the extremities. His chest was covered in scars, some old, white, and faded, others jagged, pink, and rough. Blast scars. Callahan had seen hundreds of them. He had a few of his own. Callahan grabbed thick, thermal blankets from the back room and piled them over the man's torso, leaving his head exposed. He needed to check the man's airway and pupil response. He reached out and carefully peeled the shattered ski goggles away from the man's face. They were frozen to the fabric of the balaclava. Callahan gripped the edge of the dark wool mask and pulled it up and over the man's head. The firelight danced across the stranger's face. He had a deep, jagged scar running from his left cheekbone down to his jawline. His lips were blue, his beard caked with ice, and his eyes were closed. Callahan stopped breathing. The trauma shears slipped from his hand, clattering loudly onto the hardwood floor. It was impossible. The logic centers of his brain flatly rejected the visual information his eyes were sending. "Thomas?" Callahan whispered, his voice cracking. The man lying on his floor was Thomas Reed. 12 years ago, Callahan was the squad leader of a Tier 1 asset recovery team at the mountains of Khost Province, Afghanistan. Thomas Reed was their CIA Special Activities Division liaison. Reed was a ghost, a man who didn't officially exist, tasked with cultivating local assets and finding high-value targets. He was also one of the finest operators Callahan had ever worked with, a man who had saved Callahan's life during a brutal firefight in a dry riverbed. But Thomas Reed was dead. Callahan remembered the day with agonizing clarity. It was August 14th, 2014. Reed had entered a suspected Taliban safe house to secure a hard drive, just like the one currently strapped to his chest. The building had been rigged. A massive secondary IED had detonated. Callahan, providing overwatch from a Black Hawk helicopter just lifting off the deck, had watched the entire 2-story compound vaporize into a cloud of dust and fire. There was no body to recover. The CIA had carved a star into the marble wall at Langley, and Callahan had drunk a glass of whiskey in silence for a man he considered a brother. Yet, here he was, older, battered, half-frozen, but undeniably Thomas Reed. How? Callahan breathed, stepping back, his hand instinctively dropping to the grip of his pistol. In the intelligence community, dead men who walked back into the light rarely brought good news. If Reed had survived the blast, Where had he been for 12 years? Why had he never contacted his handlers? Yes. Well, and more terrifyingly, why was he here? At a highly classified, off-the-grid location that only 3 people in the Pentagon knew about. The man on the floor groaned. A low, wet sound that rattled in his chest. His eyelids fluttered. Struggling against the frost on his lashes, Callahan immediately dropped to his knees beside him, grabbing a canteen of lukewarm water. He lifted Reed's head slightly. Tommy, it's John. Don't try to speak. Just swallow. He pressed the canteen to Reed's cracked lips. The man choked down a small mouthful, coughing weakly. His eyes slowly opened. They were bloodshot, out of focus, scanning the wooden beams of the ceiling before slowly locking onto Callahan's face. For a moment, there was nothing but the confusion of a dying man. Then, a spark of recognition flared in Reed's dark eyes. He didn't look relieved. He looked terrified. Reed's frozen, trembling hand reached out, grabbing the front of Callahan's shirt with surprising, desperate strength. John. Reed's voice was a gravelly whisper, destroyed by the cold and years of disuse. I'm here, Tommy. You're safe. The perimeter is secure, Callahan said, falling back into operational protocol to calm the man. You're in Montana. You're alive. Reed shook his head weakly, his grip tightening on Callahan's shirt. He pulled Callahan closer, his breath smelling of copper and exhaustion. No, Reed rasped, his eyes wide with a frantic urgency. He glanced weakly down at the titanium drive still resting on his chest, then back to Callahan. Not safe. John, they didn't just find me. Reed swallowed hard, coughing violently before forcing the next words out. They followed me. They're already here. Before Callahan could react, Ares let out a deafening, vicious roar. The dog spun away from the window, his teeth bared, staring violently at the heavy oak front door. From outside, over the screaming roar of the blizzard, Callahan heard the distinct, mechanical crack of his porch steps breaking under heavy, synchronized boots. The heavy, mechanical crunch of tactical boots on the icy porch instantly shattered the reunion. John Callahan didn't ask questions. In the span of a single heartbeat, he transitioned from a shocked friend back into a Tier 1 operator. Ares Blabe, Callahan barked, using the German command for stay to keep the dog positioned out of the fatal funnel of the doorway. Callahan lunged toward the cabin's main electrical panel mounted beside the kitchen entrance. He slammed his palm against the master breaker. The warm, flickering lights of the cabin instantly died, plunging the interior into absolute suffocating darkness, illuminated only by the faint dying embers inside the cast-iron wood stove. In the pitch black, Callahan's hands moved with terrifying muscle memory. He reached under the kitchen island counter and retrieved his tactical vest, a lightweight Crye-precision plate carrier, holding spare magazines and medical gear. As he slipped it over his shoulders, he pulled down his helmet, flipping the mount on his dual-tube PVS, 1.5 night vision goggles. The world shifted into a sharp, monochromatic green hue. Tactical assessment, asterisk hostiles. Unknown number, highly trained, stealth approach in a blizzard. Asterisk environment. Complete blackout. -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside. Structural cover, inside. Asterisk assets. 1 M4 carbine. 1 SIG-P, 226. 1 fully trained multi-purpose canine. 1 critically injured. VIP. The silence that followed the initial footsteps was more terrifying than a war cry. These weren't amateurs kicking in a door. These were professionals quietly stacking up on the entryway, communicating with hand signals. Thwip. A suppressed bullet punched through the heavy oak of the front door, passing exactly through the space where Callahan's chest had been 3 seconds earlier. It embedded itself deep into the stone masonry of the fireplace. They had thermal imaging. They could see his heat signature through the wood. Callahan dropped flat onto his stomach, sliding across the hardwood floor until he was positioned behind the dense, bullet-stopping mass of the cast-iron stove. Beside him, Thomas Reed lay motionless, his breathing shallow, the titanium hard drive still resting on his chest. Ares, Verstecken, Callahan whispered. "Hide." The German shepherd immediately crawled low to the ground, sliding beneath the heavy oak dining table, his amber eyes glowing faintly in the ambient light. Muscles coiled like a steel spring. Outside, a metallic clink echoed over the howling wind. Callahan recognized the sound instantly, the arming spoon of a flashbang grenade. But they weren't throwing it, they were fixing it to a breaching charge on the hinges. "Cover!" Callahan yelled, throwing his own body over Reed's shivering form. The explosion tore through the night. The concussion rocked the cabin, shattering the front windows and blowing the heavy oak door completely off its reinforced steel hinges. A blinding flash of white light filled the room, followed by a thick cloud of pulverized wood and smoke. Before the smoke could even begin to clear, 3 figures in snow camouflage tactical gear flooded through the threshold. They moved with lethal fluidity, their suppressed rifles sweeping the room, green lasers cutting through the dust. Callahan didn't wait for them to acquire targets. He leveled his M4 from his prone position behind the stove and squeezed the trigger. Crack, crack, crack. 3 rounds of 5.56 millimeters hollow point ammunition caught the lead breacher in the center of his chest. The kinetic energy lifted the man off his feet, throwing him backward into the blizzard. The second operator instantly returned fire. A hail of suppressed rounds chewing through the floorboards and ricocheting off the cast-iron stove, sending sparks flying over Callahan's head. "Ares fast!" Callahan roared. From beneath the dining table, 75 pounds of pure, trained aggression launched into the air. Ares didn't bark. He crossed the room in a blur of fur and muscle, leaping directly over the couch. He hit the second operator square in the chest, his powerful jaws locking onto the man's forearm just behind the wrist. The operator screamed, his rifle clattering to the floor as Ares's momentum took them both down in a chaotic tangle of limbs and tactical gear. Callahan shifted his aim to the third man, who was frantically trying to transition to a sidearm while aiming at the dog. Callahan fired twice. The operator slumped against the doorframe and slid to the icy floor, motionless. Ares was still locked onto the second man, violently shaking his head, disabling the threat's weapon arm. The operator was desperately reaching for a combat knife, strapped to his thigh with his free hand. Callahan lunged across the room, driving the buttstock of his M4 down hard into the operator's helmet. The man went limp. "Ares, Oss, higher," Callahan commanded. The dog instantly released his grip, spitting the taste of Kevlar and blood from his mouth, and trotted back to Callahan's side, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on the open doorway. Callahan kept his rifle raised, staring out into the swirling, violent whiteout of the blizzard. The wind screamed through the shattered doorway, bringing a fresh wave of agonizing cold into the cabin. He waited for the second wave. He waited for the sniper round. Nothing came. The surviving attackers had pulled back into the tree line, realizing their thermal advantage was gone and the element of surprise had cost them 3 men. They were regrouping. Callahan grabbed the tactical harness of the unconscious operator on the floor and dragged him outside, dumping him on the porch. He then hauled the shattered remains of the heavy oak door back into the frame, wedging it shut with the heavy wooden dining table and 2 metal chairs. It wouldn't hold against another explosive breach, but it would buy him time. The cabin was freezing rapidly. With the door compromised and the windows blown out, the ambient temperature inside was dropping by the minute. The blizzard outside showed no signs of stopping, a chaotic symphony of howling wind and driving snow. Callahan clicked on a red lens tactical flashlight, keeping his visual signature low. He knelt beside Reed, who was shivering violently, his eyes rolling back in his head. "Tommy, stay with me," Callahan urged, slapping the man's frozen cheek lightly. Callahan knew they couldn't stay in the main living area. He grabbed Reed by the shoulders of his plate carrier and dragged him across the floor toward the kitchen. Beneath a large braided rug lay the entrance to Callahan's root cellar, a reinforced concrete-lined bunker he had built for exactly this kind of nightmare. He kicked the rug aside, hauled open the heavy steel trap door, and dragged Reed down the wooden stairs into the darkness. Ares followed closely, his paws clicking on the steps, before Callahan pulled the heavy hatch shut above them, bolting it from the inside. The cellar was small, lined with canned goods, bottled water, and ammunition crates, More importantly, it was insulated by the earth. Callahan sparked a small kerosene lantern, bathing the concrete walls in a dim yellow glow. He stripped the rest of Reed's wet gear off, wrapping him tightly in 2 thermal mylar blankets. He then opened a trauma kit, pulled out a syringe of epinephrine, and injected a microdose into Reed's thigh to keep his heart from stopping due to the shock and cold. Reed gasped, his back arching off the concrete floor as the adrenaline hit his system. His eyes snapped open, wild and panicked, before focusing on Callahan's face in the lantern light. They breached? Reed asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. I handled the entry team, Callahan said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He was running entirely on operational adrenaline now. 3 down. The rest fell back to the tree line. The storm is keeping them pinned down, but they'll maneuver once they realize I'm not coming out. Callahan sat back on an ammunition crate, staring at the ghost from his past. He pointed a dirt-smudged finger at the titanium hard drive resting beside Reed on the cot. 12 years, Tommy, Callahan said, the betrayal bleeding through his stoic facade. I watched that compound turn into a crater. I packed up your footlocker. I lied to your sister and told her you died quickly. Where the hell have you been? Reed let out a ragged, painful cough. He clutched his chest, squeezing his eyes shut. I wasn't in the compound, John, Reed whispered. I never went inside. Callahan frowned, his mind racing to align his memories with this impossible new truth. I watched you walk through the courtyard. I saw the detonation. You saw a local asset wearing my gear. Reed corrected, his voice trembling with a mixture of cold and deep-seated guilt. I was a mile away, zip-tied in the back of a van, and we didn't hit a Taliban IED, John. Reed forced himself to sit up slightly, the mylar blanket rustling loudly in the quiet cellar. He looked Callahan dead in the eyes. We were hit by a Hellfire missile, fired by one of our own Reaper drones. The silence in the cellar was absolute. Callahan's blood ran cold, colder than the blizzard raging above them. He remembered the deafening roar, the massive fireball that was entirely too large for a standard fertilizer bomb. Who? Callahan demanded, his voice dropping to a lethal, dangerous register. CIA Special Activities Division. Director William Sterling, Reed said, spitting the name out like poison. He was running an off-book operation called Sandglass. He wasn't tracking high-value targets in Coast. He was arming them, funneling seized cartel weapons and untraceable cash to warlords to destabilize the region and keep the war machine turning. He was building his own private kingdom. And you found out, Callahan surmised. I found the ledger, Reed nodded, tapping the titanium drive. I encrypted it and copied it to this drive. Sterling found out I had it. He couldn't risk me getting it to an oversight committee. But he also couldn't kill me until he knew where the master file was. So he ordered the drone strike on the compound to wipe out your team, the only people who knew I was there, and faked my death. Callahan's grip on his rifle tightened until his knuckles turned white. His entire squad, good men, dead, not in the defense of their country, but to cover up a corrupt bureaucrat's treason. Where did they take you? Callahan asked. A black site in Romania, then a subterranean facility in Idaho. For 12 years. John. 12 years in a concrete box, Reed said. A tear finally escaping his eye, cutting a clean line through the dirt and grime on his cheek. They tortured me. They tried to break the encryption. But I hardwired the drive. It requires a dual biometric scan, my retinal print, and a localized decryption key that I buried in the code. I never gave it to them. How did you escape? A guard got careless, Reed said, his eyes darkening. I killed him with his own bootlaces. I stole his gear, hijacked a transport vehicle, and drove north. I knew about your cabin, John. You told me about this place once, during a layover in Ramstein. You said it was the only place you'd go when the world ended. I figured my world had ended, so I came here. And you brought them right to my front door, Callahan said quietly. I didn't have a choice, Reed pleaded. These aren't standard PMCs up there, John. They're Vanguard solutions. Sterling's private hit squad. Elias Mercer is leading them. They track thermal footprints from low-orbit satellites. The storm masked me for a while, But once my vehicle died, they found my trail. Callahan stood up, pacing the small confines of the cellar. The pieces were falling into place. Elias Mercer. He knew the name. Mercer was a disgraced former Delta Force operator who had been court-martialed for executing unarmed combatants. Now, he was a mercenary for the highest bidder. "What's on the drive, exactly?" Callahan asked, looking down at the titanium box. "Everything," Reed said. "Bank routes, offshore accounts, audio recordings of Sterling authorizing the strike on your team. It's enough to burn Sterling and his entire network to the ground, but we need to decrypt it and broadcast it. If they kill us and take the drive back, the truth dies with us." Callahan looked at the ceiling. Above them, he could hear the faint, muffled sound of heavy boots walking across the shattered floorboards of his living room. The Vanguard operators hadn't retreated far. They had breached the cabin again, securing the high ground. Waiting them out, they were trapped in a concrete box, surrounded by highly trained killers, in the middle of a historic blizzard. Callahan reached down and unclipped a fragmentation grenade from his plate carrier. He looked at Ares, who was sitting attentively at the base of the stairs, ears swiveling to track the footsteps above. "Tommy," Callahan said, a cold, predatory smile creeping onto his face for the first time in years. "They made a tactical error." Reed looked confused. "What error?" "They have us pinned. They assumed," Callahan said, racking the charging handle of his M4, "that I built this bunker to hide." Callahan walked to the far wall of the cellar and pulled away a heavy wooden shelving unit, revealing a dark, narrow, earthen tunnel reinforced with timber. "I built it to flank." The escape tunnel was 3 feet wide, shored up by thick pine timbers, and smelled of damp earth and frost. Callahan had dug it by hand over the course of 2 brutal summers, a paranoid contingency that had just become their only lifeline. He moved through the darkness with practiced efficiency, his rifle compressed against his chest, sliding on his knees and elbows. Ares crawled right behind him, the dog's belly scraping the dirt, completely silent. To a civilian, this enclosed space would be a claustrophobic nightmare. To Callahan, it was a tactical artery. "Stay put, Tommy," Callahan had whispered before sliding the heavy shelving unit back into place, sealing Reed in the cellar. "When the shooting stops, wait for my voice. If you hear anyone else, you use the drive to negotiate. But I plan on killing them all." 70 yards later, the tunnel began to angle sharply upward. Callahan reached the terminus, a heavy steel grate concealed beneath a massive hollowed-out tree stump and a camouflage tarp. He pushed the grate open, shouldering through 2 feet of accumulated snow, and dragged himself out into the raging blizzard. The wind hit him like a physical blow, instantly freezing the sweat on his face. The ambient light was practically zero. He flipped his night vision goggles down, but the heavy snowfall created a blinding wall of green static, the infrared illuminator reflecting off millions of swirling flakes. He pushed the goggles up and relied on his naked eyes. He was positioned up the ridge, approximately 50 yards behind the cabin. Through the driving snow, he could see the faint, amber glow of flashlights sweeping the interior of his ruined home. Vanguard Solutions, Elias Mercer's men. They were highly trained, well-equipped, and completely unaware that they were now standing inside a fatal funnel of their own making. Callahan knelt in the deep snow, the cold seeping through his tactical pants. He tapped his thigh twice. Ares immediately moved to his side, pressing his warm flank against Callahan's leg. "Track," Callahan whispered. Ares lowered his snout, inhaling the freezing air. The dog's ears twitched. He caught a scent that didn't belong to the pine or the snow gun oil, sweat and synthetic fabrics. Ares pointed his muzzle toward a cluster of heavy snow-draped spruces to their left. Callahan moved like a phantom, stepping in the exact indentations left by the falling snow to mask his tracks. As he flanked the tree line, the shape of a Vanguard operator materialized in the gloom. The man was holding a suppressed SCAR-H rifle, acting as rear security, his thermal optics scanning the empty woods, completely oblivious to the threat approaching from his blind spot. Callahan didn't want to risk a gunshot. The wind was loud, but Mercer was a seasoned veteran. he would recognize the auditory signature of a 5.56 round. Even suppressed, he slung his rifle and drew a matte black combat knife. Callahan closed the final 10 feet in absolute silence. He clamped his left hand over the operator's mouth, simultaneously driving the knife up and under the base of the man's Kevlar helmet, severing the brainstem. The man went entirely limp without a single sound. Callahan lowered the heavy body gently into the snowdrift, covering the dark stain of blood with a kick of fresh white powder. One, down. He moved toward the back of the cabin. Through the shattered kitchen window, he could see 2 more operators standing over the braided rug that concealed the cellar trapdoor. One of them was uncoiling a heavy yellow cable attached to a portable generator on his back, a thermal lance. They were preparing to burn through the steel hatch and roast whoever was inside the concrete bunker. Callahan's heart hammered against his ribs. He had less than 3 minutes before they breached the cellar and found Thomas Reed. Suddenly, the back door of the cabin swung open, violently ripping off its hinges in the wind. A 4th operator stepped out onto the back porch, a heavy spotlight in his hand. Sweeping the tree line, Callahan was caught in the open, kneeling beside a stack of chopped firewood. If the spotlight hit him, he was dead. He looked at Aries. He didn't need to speak. He simply locked eyes with the dog and gave a sharp, downward flick of his wrist. Aries vanished into the blizzard. The operator on the porch swept the beam across the yard. As the light passed over the firewood, a 75-pound shadow launched itself from the roof of the woodshed directly above the man. Aries hit the operator with the force of a freight train, his jaws locking onto the side of the man's neck, completely bypassing the body armor. The impact threw them both off the porch and into the deep snow. The man's scream was instantly muffled by the dog's crushing grip and the roaring wind. Callahan didn't hesitate. He brought his M4 up, acquired the 2 men inside the kitchen through his holographic sight, and squeezed the trigger. The glass of the kitchen window shattered outward. The first operator, holding the thermal lance, took 2 rounds to the side of the head, his helmet splintering as he collapsed over the trapdoor. The second operator spun around, raising his weapon, but Callahan was already moving, firing as he advanced. 2 rounds caught the man in the upper chest, right where the ceramic plates met the collarbone, dropping him instantly. The cabin fell silent, save for the shrieking wind and the dying hum of the portable generator. Callahan whistled a low, sharp sound. A moment later, Aries trotted out of the darkness, his muzzle stained crimson, his tail wagging once. "Good boy," Callahan breathed, stepping onto the back porch. But as he reached the threshold, a terrifying realization washed over him. He had counted 3 men in the initial breach, and he had just killed 4 more. 7 operators. A standard Vanguard hit squad, operated in teams of 8. Where was Elias Mercer? Before his brain could process the tactical failure, the wooden floorboards beneath Callahan's boots exploded. High-caliber rounds tore through the crawl space beneath the cabin, splintering the floor and ripping through the air inches from Callahan's face. Mercer hadn't been in the kitchen. He had been underneath the house, tracking Callahan's movements through the floorboards using a seismic sensor. Callahan dove backward off the porch, landing hard in the snow just as a final burst of automatic fire shredded the doorframe where he had been standing. Pain flared in his left shoulder, a grazing hit, slicing through the tactical fabric and carving a hot trench across his deltoid. "Aries, flank!" Callahan yelled, scrambling behind the reinforced stone foundation of the chimney. From beneath the cabin, a dark figure rolled out into the snow. Elias Mercer stood up. He was a massive man, wearing a sleek, heavily armored exoskeleton suit over his winter gear, holding a customized MK-18 assault rifle. "You're losing your edge, John." Mercer's voice boomed over the howling wind, amplified by an external speaker on his tactical helmet. 10 years ago, you would have cleared the crawl space first." Callahan leaned out from behind the stone chimney and fired a 3-round burst. The bullet sparked off the heavy ballistic plating on Mercer's chest, barely staggering the mercenary. "Standard 5.56 isn't going to cut it against level 4 ceramic, John." Mercer laughed, raising his rifle. "Sterling sends his regards. He also wants you to know that the airstrike he ordered on these coordinates hits in exactly 12 minutes. Even if you kill me, You and your ghost friend are turning to glass. Callahan's mind raced. An airstrike. Sterling was tying up loose ends by leveling the entire mountain. Callahan slapped a fresh magazine into his rifle. He didn't have time for a prolonged firefight. He had to neutralize Mercer, get Reed out of the cellar, and find a way off the property before the sky fell on them. You talk too much, Elias, Callahan muttered. Callahan pulled a flashbang from his vest, pulled the pin, and hurled it high over the roof of the cabin. Mercer tracked the movement, turning his shielded helmet away to avoid the blinding light. But Callahan hadn't thrown it to blind him. He threw it to create a secondary auditory distraction. As the grenade detonated with a deafening crack on the opposite side of the cabin, Callahan broke from cover, sprinting through the waist-deep snow directly toward Mercer. Mercer whipped his head back, surprised by the aggressive maneuver, and raised his rifle. Before he could pull the trigger, a blur of teeth and muscle slammed into the back of his knees. Ares had circled the property, striking from the blind spot just as Callahan intended. The heavy exoskeleton kept Mercer from falling, but the impact forced his aim wide. A burst of gunfire chewed through the pine branches above Callahan's head. Callahan closed the distance. He knew he couldn't penetrate the body armor, so he bypassed it entirely. He dropped his rifle, letting it hang by the sling, and lunged forward, drawing his combat knife. Mercer backhanded Ares, sending the heavy dog flying into a snowdrift with a sickening yelp. Ares, Callahan roared, the sight of his dog being hurt igniting a cold, violent rage inside him. Callahan slammed into Mercer, driving his left shoulder into the mercenary's chest plate while simultaneously sweeping his right leg. The sheer momentum brought them both crashing down into the frozen mud and snow beneath the eaves of the cabin. Mercer was terrifyingly strong. He dropped his rifle and wrapped his massive armored hands around Callahan's throat, squeezing with hydraulic-assisted force. "You're a relic, John," Mercer hissed, his face inches from Callahan's. "You died the day your team blew up in Coast. You just didn't have the decency to stop breathing." Black spots danced in Callahan's vision. His windpipe was crushing under the pressure. He thrashed, trying to break the grip, but Mercer's armored suit made him practically immovable. Callahan's right hand, still gripping the combat knife, was pinned between their bodies. He couldn't reach Mercer's neck or under the arms. He had only one option. Using the last ounce of his fading strength, Callahan twisted his wrist, angled the blade of his knife inward, and drove it with all his might directly through the top of Mercer's heavy tactical boot, pinning the man's foot to the frozen ground. Mercer roared in pain, his grip loosening on Callahan's throat for a fraction of a second. It was all Callahan needed. He violently wrenched himself free, gasping for the freezing air, and rolled away. Mercer ripped the knife from his foot with a grunt, his eyes burning with lethal intent. He reached for a heavy sidearm strapped to his hip. Suddenly, a low, guttural snarl echoed through the blizzard. Ares, bleeding from a cut above his eye but very much alive, was standing on the porch above them. The dog didn't leap this time. He simply stared at Callahan, waiting for the final, lethal command. Callahan, kneeling in the snow, wiped a stream of blood from his mouth. He looked at the man who had helped slaughter his team 12 years ago. "Ares," Callahan said, his voice dropping to a deadly, ice-cold whisper. "Toten, kill." Ares launched himself off the porch. Mercer raised his pistol, but his pinned, injured foot threw off his balance. The dog bypassed the arms entirely, his powerful jaws snapping shut directly on Mercer's exposed throat, right below the rim of the tactical helmet. Mercer collapsed backward into the snow, the heavy pistol falling from his grip. He thrashed wildly for a few seconds, his armored hands tearing at the dog's thick coat. But Ares held on with the relentless, unyielding grip of a trained predator until the mercenary finally went still. Callahan slowly pushed himself up from the snow. His shoulder was burning, his throat felt crushed, and the adrenaline was beginning to crash. He staggered over to Ares, gently placing a hand on the dog's head. "Os," he whispered softly. Ares released his grip and sat down in the snow, panting heavily, leaning his bloody head against Callahan's leg. Callahan looked down at Mercer's body. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the nightmare was far from over. He reached down and stripped the tactical radio from Mercer's vest. He pressed the transmit button. "Vanguard Actual. This is 01. A cold, synthetic voice crackled over the secure channel. Acknowledge status of target. Airstrike is wheels up. ETA 9 minutes. Callahan stared at the radio. 9 minutes. The blizzard was too severe for a helicopter extraction, and the roads were buried under 4 feet of snow. The nearest cover that could survive a bunker-buster missile was an abandoned silver mine 3 miles away. They would never make it on foot. Callahan keyed the mic. "Sterling," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "This is John Callahan. You missed me in Coast." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. "Callahan." Sterling's voice finally replied, losing the synthetic distortion, sounding remarkably calm. "I must admit, your survival instincts are commendable. But geography is against you. 1. In 8 minutes, that entire grid square ceases to exist. There is nowhere to run." "I'm not running," Callahan replied. Staring out into the blinding whiteout, he dropped the radio into the snow and crushed it under his heel. He turned and limped back into the ruined, blood-soaked cabin, heading straight for the cellar trapdoor. He had 8 minutes to decrypt the most dangerous hard drive in the world, broadcast it to the Pentagon, and somehow survive the wrath of the United States military dropping out of the sky. Callahan hauled the heavy shelving unit away from the cellar wall, his boots slipping on the slick, bloody floorboards of his destroyed home. He tore open the steel trapdoor and dropped into the dim, kerosene-lit bunker. 7 minutes and 20 seconds. Thomas Reed was sitting up, clutching the titanium hard drive, his eyes wide as he saw Callahan covered in snow, grease, and Elias Mercer's blood. The German shepherd, Ares, limped down the wooden stairs behind Callahan, collapsing onto the concrete floor with a heavy, exhausted sigh. "Mercer?" Reed asked, his voice shaking. "Dead," Callahan rasped, grabbing a trauma dressing from the wall and wrapping it tightly over the grazing bullet wound on his shoulder. But Sterling just called in a broken arrow. "We have a J-Dam bunker buster dropping on this exact grid square in less than 7 minutes. Reed's face drained of what little color it had left. "A J-Dam? The cellar won't survive a direct hit from a GBU. 3-1. We need to run. Through 4 feet of snow and a whiteout, we'd make it maybe 100 yards before the shockwave liquefied our organs," Callahan said coldly. He moved to the back corner of the cellar, kicking aside a stack of heavy MRE boxes. Beneath them was a heavy steel lockbox. Callahan punched in a code, throwing the lid open. Inside sat a heavily modified Panasonic Toughbook and a portable Starlink flat high-performance satellite terminal. "We aren't running yet," Callahan said, booting up the laptop. The screen cast a harsh, blue glow across his battered face. "If we die out there in the snow, Sterling wins. He covers it up, another tragic gas leak or rogue bear attack. I am not letting my team's killer walk away. We decrypt the drive, and we broadcast it to the Pentagon." Reed staggered to his feet, pulling the mylar blanket tight around his shivering shoulders. "John, I told you, I hardwired the drive. It needs my retinal scan. But the localized decryption key, I buried it in a geo-fenced algorithm. It requires a specific physical location to unlock." Callahan plugged a reinforced USB-C cable from the Toughbook into the titanium drive. "I know. That's why you didn't go to the FBI in Idaho. That's why you drove a hijacked truck through a..." Reed stared at him, stunned. "You figured it out. You told me you built the key 12 years ago, Callahan said, rapidly typing command prompts to bypass his own firewall. 12 years ago, this cabin was the only off-grid location we both knew about. You tied the decryption key to the GPS coordinates of this exact property. It's a dead man's switch. You couldn't unlock it anywhere else." Reed nodded slowly. "Latitude 45.82, longitude -114.33. The drive's internal GPS has to ping off a satellite from this location to verify the code." Callahan grabbed the Starlink dish and shoved it up the stairs, resting it on the highest step just below the shattered floorboards, so it had a clear line of sight to the sky through the ruined roof. "We have signal. 5 minutes, Tommy." "Do it." Callahan stepped back. Reed knelt before the tough book. He leaned forward, aligning his right eye with the biometric scanner built into the casing of the titanium drive. A red laser swept across his pupil. Beep. Retinalscan confirmed. Awaiting geolocation verification. The laptop screen blinked wildly. The wind outside roared, a deafening reminder of the hell that was about to rain down on them. Callahan watched the satellite uplink connection bar. In a blizzard this thick, packet loss was a massive risk. If the connection dropped before the GPS handshake completed, the drive would permanently wipe itself. "Come on," Callahan muttered, his hand resting on Ares' head. "Cut through the storm. Full minute." Suddenly, the screen flashed bright green. Decryption complete. Access granted. Files flooded the screen. Hundreds of them. Spreadsheets outlining offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, black market weapon manifests, and audio logs. Callahan didn't hesitate. He opened a secure, encrypted Tor browser and routed a direct connection to the Department of Defense Inspector General's anonymous whistleblower drop, copying the SEC DEF's private server and 3 major national news syndicates. He hit Send All. A progress bar appeared. Uploading. 1.2 gigabytes. Estimated time. 3 minutes. 3 minutes? Reed gasped. "The missile hits in 3 minutes. Then we hold the line," Callahan said, his eyes locked on the progress bar. 10%. 30%. The ground beneath them began to vibrate. It wasn't the wind. It was the deep, resonant hum of an F-35 Lightning II cutting through the stratosphere miles above them. 50%, 65%. "John," Reed said, panic creeping into his voice. "We have to get into the tunnel now. We have to get as deep underground as possible." "Not until it's sent," Callahan growled, gripping the edge of the table. 80%, 90%. The scream of the incoming munition became audible over the blizzard, a terrifying, high-pitched shriek of displaced air that tore through the night sky. The JDAM had been dropped. It was in freefall. 98%. 99%. "Sent," Callahan roared, slamming the laptop shut. "Move." Callahan grabbed Reed by the harness of his plate carrier and shoved him toward the narrow earthen tunnel hidden behind the shelving unit. Ares didn't need to be told twice. The German Shepherd shot into the darkness of the tunnel, sensing the catastrophic pressure drop in the air above them. Callahan threw himself into the dirt passage right behind Reed. "Crawl! Go! Don't stop!" The JDAM wasn't just a bomb. It was a physics-defying nightmare of kinetic energy and high explosives designed to vaporize reinforced concrete. Callahan knew the escape tunnel wouldn't save them if they were under the cabin. But 50 yards out, the tunnel dipped sharply downward, passing directly beneath a massive natural slab of solid bitterroot granite. It was the only reason Callahan hadn't dug the tunnel straight. He couldn't break through the rock, so he dug under it. They scrambled through the dark, their elbows bleeding, chests heaving. The shrieking sound of the bomb grew so loud it felt like it was inside their skulls. "Under the rock! Get under the rock!" Callahan screamed. They reached the low point of the tunnel, pressing their bodies flat against the damp earth. Wedged directly beneath the 10-foot-thick granite shelf, Callahan pulled Ares tightly to his chest, wrapping his arms around the dog's head to protect his eardrums, and opened his mouth to keep his own lungs from rupturing from the overpressure. The bomb hit. There was no sound, only a violent, world-ending erasure of the senses. The earth liquefied. The shockwave hit the granite slab above them with the force of an earthquake, cracking the massive stone down the middle. Dirt collapsed around them, burying them in absolute darkness. The air was instantly sucked from the tunnel, replaced by a searing wave of heat and the suffocating smell of cordite and pulverized rock. For 2 full minutes, the world simply ceased to exist. Then, slowly, the agonizing ringing in Callahan's ears gave way to the sound of coughing. "Tommy?" Callahan choked out, spitting dirt from his mouth. "Yeah." Reed coughed violently from the darkness beside him. "Yeah, I'm here. I'm breathing." Ares whined, shifting his weight and shaking a massive pile of dirt off his fur. Callahan pushed his hand upward. The granite slab had held, acting as a shield against the thermal blast and the kinetic shockwave. But the entrance and exit of the tunnel were completely collapsed. Callahan clicked on a small penlight. They were entombed in a space no larger than a coffin. "We're buried," Reed said, a note of despair finally breaking his voice. "We survived the blast, but we're buried alive. I spent 2 summers digging this hole," Callahan said, pulling a collapsible entrenching tool from his tactical belt. "I know exactly how much dirt is between us and the surface. Start digging." It took them 4 agonizing hours to claw their way through the collapsed earth and snow. When Callahan's shovel finally broke through the surface, a blinding beam of morning sunlight pierced the darkness. They dragged themselves out of the crater. The blizzard had broken. The sky was a brilliant, crystal-clear blue. Completely indifferent to the violence of the night before, Callahan stood up and looked back at his property. The cabin was gone. The porch, the trees, the wood stove, the bodies of the Vanguard mercenaries, all of it had been erased. Replaced by a smoking, blackened crater 50 feet deep and 100 feet wide. "It's gone," Reed whispered, standing beside him, completely awestruck by the devastation. "It did its job," Callahan said simply. He looked down at Ares, who was sniffing a piece of scorched wood, his tail giving a slow, steady wag. They were alive. 48 hours later, in a luxurious, glass-walled office in Langley, Virginia. CIA Director William Sterling sat at his mahogany desk, sipping a cup of black coffee. He watched the morning news, a smug sense of satisfaction resting on his face. Operation Sandglass was safe. The loose ends in Montana had been vaporized. Suddenly, the news anchor's face went pale. The broadcast cut away from the weather report to an emergency breaking news graphic. "We are interrupting our broadcast to bring you a massive breaking story out of Washington. Major news outlets and the Department of Defense have just received a massive, encrypted data dump detailing an alleged off-book CIA black operation known as Sandglass. The files contain undeniable audio proof of." Sterling's coffee cup slipped from his fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. The heavy oak doors to his office swung open. 4 men in dark suits, flanked by heavily armed military police, stepped into the room. "Director William Sterling," the lead FBI agent said, his voice devoid of any respect. "You are under arrest for treason, conspiracy, and the unauthorized use of military assets on domestic soil. Hands behind your back." Sterling slowly stood up, looking past the agents to the television screen, where the anchor was now showing a photograph of Thomas Reed and John Callahan's destroyed squad in Afghanistan. The ghost he tried to bury had just pulled him into the grave, thousands of miles away. On a remote, unnamed highway carving through the Canadian Rockies, a battered pickup truck rolled southward. Inside, John Callahan sat behind the wheel, watching the snow-capped peaks roll by. In the passenger seat, Thomas Reed was asleep, his head resting against the window, finally free from a 12-year nightmare. In the back, Ares had his head hanging out the window, catching the freezing winter breeze, fully content. Callahan reached over and turned up the radio. The news was playing, dominated by the fallout of the Sandglass leak. "They were heroes," the broadcast said. "Unknown patriots who had exposed the rot at the highest levels." But Callahan knew they couldn't go back. They were dead men walking, ghosts in the machine. And for the first time in a very long time, John Callahan was perfectly fine with that. He had his dog, he had his brother in arms, and the whole world in front of him. The ghosts had won. If this real-life-inspired thriller kept you on the edge of your seat from the first freezing gust of wind to the final explosive twist, don't let the story end here. The world of covert operations, unbreakable bonds, and tactical survival is vast. And there are countless more stories just waiting to be uncovered. Do you think you could have survived the breach like John Callahan, or outsmarted a corrupt system like Thomas Reed? Drop a comment below and let us know your favorite moment. Make sure to hit that like button, share this video with anyone who loves an adrenaline-pumping military drama, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on the next high-stakes mission. Turn on those notifications, and we'll see you on the next drop.